So let's get started. You wake up, it's time for well I got
Hey girl, you like me a little bit?
guys, I'm sorry about this.
A little bit?
Sorry about that.
Is your crab kinda dumb? Does he think that plastic's gum?
Is he claustrophobic or doesn't really? You wake up, it's time for coffee. You go downstairs, it's time for coffee. You sit on the couch, it's time for coffee.
Oh god, pig.
You go to work, it's time for coffee. You get fired, it's time for coffee. And about by 5 a.m., it's time for coffee. You get home, it's time for coffee. You go to bed, it's time for coffee. When you wake up, it's time for coffee. You get dressed, it's time for coffee. Hug a teddy bear, it's time for coffee. When you run out of coffee, you make more coffee. And about at 5 a.m., you drink some more coffee. You go downstairs, it's time for coffee. You go to the kitchen, it's time for coffee. You go to do your homework, it's time for coffee. You try and find your lost picture, it's time for coffee. When you're taking a poop, it's time for coffee. When you're washing your hands, it's time for coffee. When you're taking a bath, it's time for coffee. When you sit down, it's time for coffee. When you sit down again, it's time for coffee. A bench. When you get a car accident, it's time for coffee. When you take out the trash, it's time for coffee. When you're about to cut down a tree, it's time for coffee. When you're trying to bust into your work to kill your manager for firing you, it's time for coffee. When you're trying to get a quad crusher to destroy your manager's business, it's time for coffee. Once you destroy the place, and your boss gets mad at you, it's time for coffee. Then if you run out of soda, you buy some more coffee. Then you drink it. When you're at the gas station, you're at the gas station filling up your car, it's time for coffee. When you're driving a truck to get these quad crushers to your mom's house, it's time for coffee. When you're watching the moths, when you're watching the moths go to the light in Fortnite, it's time for coffee. When you're by no dance sign, when you're by no parking sign, wait. If you're by no parking sign and you park there and you get a ticket, it's time for coffee. When you're looking at a bush, it's time for coffee. When you're sitting on the back of a car to rape someone, it's time for coffee. When you're trying to get in someone's house, it's time for coffee. When you keep ringing someone's doorbell and it breaks, it's time for coffee. When you're stalking someone, it's time for coffee. When you place down a launch pad, it's time for coffee. When you jump on a launch pad and when you land, it's time for coffee. When you're in your alone place with files and trash and a couch and a dual pistol, it's time for coffee. When you get out of your secret hiding spot, it's time for coffee. When you break a fire extinguisher and when it goes crazy, it's time for coffee. When you jump on the fire extinguisher, it's time for coffee. When you're trying to open someone's trunk to get their valuables, it's time for coffee. When you're trying to steal a dog, it's time for coffee. Oh, I actually want to see what's in there. That's cool. When you break the doghouse, it's time for coffee. When you're running away with the dog and the neighbor sees you, and when you get into your house, it's time for coffee. When you get the dog finally, and when you're done cooking it, and when you're done eating it, it's time for coffee. When you go into the basement with your gun out because the FBI came because you're doing so many horrible stuff, it's time for coffee. Then once you kill all of the FBI, it's time for coffee. When the tank comes, it's time for coffee. Then when you're about to get killed, it's time for coffee. Then when you're in heaven, it's time for coffee. Okay guys, that's the end of my video. See ya!